This cute little clutch purse is really easy to make because we don't have to mold any straps for it. I am going to texture the fondant using the circles and dots pattern texture sheet, and I like to use a fondant smoother when I'm texturing smaller pieces of fondant. You could certainly just go over it with a rolling pin. And then I'm just going to peel the fondant away from the texture sheet like this and flip it over. Using a piping bag, I'm going to squeeze some icing onto the bottom of the cake where it's going to attach to the edge of the fondant. I don't want any buttercream on the rest of the cake just yet because I'm going to fold the fondant over around the top of the cake as to help give me an idea of how much I need to trim off the sides. Out of these scrap pieces of fondant, I can cut smaller bits that will cover up the sides of the cake. When I'm covering a cake sort of piece by piece like this, especially one this small, I prefer to use a piping bag to squeeze the icing onto the cake before sticking the fondant on. To me, it's a lot easier than trying to spread it with a spatula. And I'm just going to add another piece to the other end of the cake. Before I fold the rest of the fondant up and over the cake, I want to make sure I remember to add some icing to the front. And I'm also going to take my spatula and cut down around the bottom here. This will hopefully seal the two pieces of fondant together while also giving the cake base a more rounded look. Then just flip the fondant over the top of the cake and start smoothing around the bottom edges and up the sides. Now I'm going to use my angled spatula to give me some guidelines for doing the front of the cake. I haven't added any icing to the back of the cake yet, and that was on purpose because see how I had to lift up the fondant in order to cut the piece that's going to be the front flap on the cake? If I had had icing on the back of my cake, then the fondant would have touched the icing and it would have just been a gross old mess. Yuck. I'm now going to use that scrap piece of fondant to cover the front of the cake up underneath the flap. Before I can add it though, I need to make sure it's the right width. So I'm just going to place it in front of the cake like this and trim off any extra. Now I'm ready to add the icing. And then once that front piece of fondant is on the cake, it's really just a matter of going around and making sure everything is attached and that there aren't any gaps where you have cake exposed. And I can see a couple of places where I need to go around and tidy up some corners and stuff with my spatula. Before I finish decorating this little cake, I want to go ahead and put it on a board. So I just put a little dab of icing there before I put the cake on so that it'll hopefully stay put and not slide around. And this is going to be really simple. I'm just going to take some piping gel and stick one of these molded button pieces to the front of the cake as a clasp. And that's all I'm going to do. This is the mold I used to make that little button. You just press the fondant into the cavity, slice off any extra with your spatula so that it's flush with the top of the mold, and if it gets moved around in the process, you can take your shaping foam and kind of redistribute the fondant inside the mold so it still, stays true to its shape. And then they normally just pop right out. The smaller ones you may need to coax out a little bit more with your fingers. But ultimately, I decided not to use that little button as the clasp for this little clutch purse, and I molded a larger medallion type thing to use instead.